So you guys we're Facebook Living this. This is kind of a new experiment for us. So that's what the camera rig is back there. So, yeah. Yeah, don't worry about it. Everybody will just see the back of your hair. It's not a big deal. So, what is that? Boss knows you're here. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Okay, it looks like the lunchroom's letting out, so we'll give everybody a few minutes to join before we get started. So I've been kind of sick for the last week, so a big sign of success is going to be as if I can manage to talk for an hour without losing my voice. So everybody keep your fingers crossed. I'll have to turn up the volume on the microphone if it gets too out of hand. Okay, so it looks like we got our little pop here and we're good. So we'll go ahead and get started. So appreciate everybody coming to the talk. So my talk is roughly called The Executives. I think sometimes I put step-by-step guide to leading large-scale agile transformation. And where this talk comes from is that I run a company called Leading Agile. We're based out of Atlanta, Georgia. And what we do is that we go in and largely try to get executives to let us come in and help them transform their organization. And, you know, just really candidly, from selling this work and doing this work, we've learned a lot about what executives care about in terms of how to measure and manage and track progress on an agile transformation. Okay? And so what this talk really is about is, if you're an executive, how do you hold your organization accountable for measurable progress through the transformation? And if you're not an executive, then this is basically a talk about what executives care about and what you should be telling them and how you should be organizing the transformation to make sure that you're giving them what they need so that they can continue to fund it. Okay? So like I said, my name is Mike Kottmeyer, and I run Leading Agile. We're about a 60-person boutique out of Atlanta, Georgia. I have what I think is a kind of unique point of view around leading agile transformations, because I never operated in an agile environment in the small. I was working for a company when I got introduced to agile about 10 or 12 years ago called CheckFree, that was doing large-scale financial services kinds of things, online banking and bill payment. They're Fiserv now. They've since been acquired by those guys a while ago now. And when we were doing Agile, it was multi-team Agile. We were figuring out program and portfolio management kinds of things long before any of that was really in vogue to talk about. We were taking David Anderson's early work on the application of theory of constraints, creating program and portfolio management structures, using what was in effect proto-Kanban, and so the issues that we're dealing with at scale and the issues that large companies face as they're trying to figure out how to adopt Agile is kind of like right in our sweet spot a little bit. And so what this talk is going to be about, what I'm going to start to do is I want to talk a little bit about how to think and understand transformation. What is in effect, the unit of value of a transformation? And that's going to go into the executive conversation in terms of what does it look like to track and plan a agile transformation? How to organize transformation work, and how to plan, manage, and track progress against the transformation. But there's going to be some introductory material in here, because if we don't get on the same page about what the unit of value in a transformation is and how to approach a transformation, all the stuff around the tracking and planning and such won't make a whole lot of sense, okay? So we're going to try to build an argument in about 50 minutes to help understand this, okay? So why do I think this is important? I think the game has largely changed. 5 or 6 years ago, one of the main questions that I would get asked from people that would they would be basically like, how do I get my executive to be interested in an agile transformation? And now I find most executives are coming to you guys and saying, hey, we need to do an agile transformation. There's very few companies now that at least aren't entertaining this in some form or fashion. But what the executives want and the executives need is they need some sort of kind of planning and control. They want to know how to adopt agile, or they want to adopt agile, but they don't know exactly how to go about it. They need line of sight in how the transformation is going to unfold, and they have to be able to continuously justify the economics of it. Okay? And that's something that sometimes as practitioners that we don't fully understand. Whether they're giving you guys training dollars, whether they're letting you hire internal staff, whether you guys are going external and hiring coaches, there's an actual fiduciary responsibility to being able to show measurable progress on a transformation. Okay? And that's largely what we want to figure out how to package up and talk about. So again, executives, this is my take, is that executives want to do this. What it's up to us to figure out how to do is how to give them safety and ground cover and be able to demonstrate measurable progress along the way. Okay? That's our responsibility here. And this is the point that I want to kind of make before we get started. In Agile, a lot of times we want to believe in emergence. We want to believe in things like, I'm going to empower the team and let the team decide. Okay? And I value that as well. Okay? But to some degree, I think we're going to have to get over this notion of like, let's just put energy into it and let it figure out. I think we have to get a little bit more comfortable with figuring out how to structure and plan these transformations. Because even if we don't believe it as individuals, the executives in the organizations that we're going into, they haven't really transformed yet. They haven't totally bought in. They want the benefits of going agile, but that mindset isn't necessarily there right out of the gate. And so what I'm asking, maybe if that's kind of your belief, is like, well, we just need to just let people just go and figure it out. I'm suggesting that your executives probably want it to be a little bit more structured and a little bit more plan driven. And so again, right, we're going to talk about what I think by that, what that means. So why do executives care? I'd love to do this in a Q&A format, but we're going to run out of time if I try to engage you guys in back and forth too much. Most of the executives that we talk to that are trying to do an agile transformation are trying to solve a business problem as a result of doing the transformation. We as practitioners a lot of times care about the environment and collaboration and communication and all those different things because we believe that they will lead to better business outcomes. But when you're talking to an exec about a transformation, the kinds of things that they typically care about are really dollars and cents related. Can we save money? Can we be more predictable? Can we get things in market faster? Can we start charging money for products before they're fully done? Are we building the right things? Are we able to be innovative? Okay? So the drivers for an executive doing a transformation are absolutely dollars and cents related. Okay? Now, when you say, well, Agile is going to solve that for me, what we need to do is we need to have a hypothesis around how Agile is actually going to do that. What are we going to do to the system of delivery so that we get these better business outcomes? Okay? So I did a version of this talk at version 1 a couple weeks ago at an Atlanta Scrum meeting, and I was challenging the room to say, if you were given a pile of money and were king for a day in your company, what would you go do to lead the transformation, knowing that in 3 to 6 months you had to demonstrate in some measurable, tangible way that it actually made the company's performance better? Okay? That's the level of bar that we're talking about, right? So if you have budget to hire people, you have budget to hire consultants, budget to send to training, what is your working hypothesis about how that training is going to produce a better measurable business outcome in 3 to 6 months? Okay? You need to have that really, really thought through. As a community, we tend to think about Agile as a cultural thing. Okay? We use the word mindset a lot. And the idea is if I can get everybody to kind of change their mind and to be more adaptive, right? To be able to, get this Agile thing that we're talking about. The idea, I think, that everybody believes is that the system of delivery will begin to emerge, okay? If we could just get everybody to think and kind of feel differently, then everything would work. And one of the pieces that I'm going to try to do here is I'm going to try to show you guys that while that would be awesome if we could get everybody on the same page at the same time, I think that's a pretty dicey game. I think it's really hard to change everybody's thoughts and minds at the same time. And the other thing that I'm going to make the case for is that in most organizations that you go into, there are legitimate systematic and technological barriers to being able to do Agile. Now, granted, if we all could flip our mindset, then those things would be easier to fix. But let's get real. Some of the problems in our companies are going to take 3, 5, 10 years to fix. Right? Certain aspects of the technology stack are not going to flip overnight. Continuous integration and deployment and DevOps is not going to turn on overnight, okay? And so this culture thing that we get kind of obsessed with is it's important, but in the face of like real barriers that take real dollars and real time to fix, right? If we're going to lead with that, we need to really understand what our hypothesis is about how that cultural transformation is going to make that business benefit difference in 3 to 6 months, right? Chances are it's going to be a longer play, okay? The other thing that we see, I'm kind of trusting that my slides are flipping behind me and I'm trying not to look at them, right? So if I get too far off, Devin, like wave at me or something, okay? Because I hate reading slides to people. So the next thing that you tend to see a lot is a very practices-driven kind of approach to transformation. And I got a really funny response. I do some volunteer work down at the University of Florida, and I was talking to a team of computer science people, and it's like, so you guys have heard of Scrum, right? They're like, oh yeah, daily stand-up, right? I'm like, yeah, okay, cool. Yeah, so grown-ups think that too, right? And it's like the idea behind like, okay, if I teach you how to do a daily stand-up, or I teach you how to write a user story, I teach you how to do a review and retrospective, and all those things, right? Those are the enabling practices of being Agile, right? They don't necessarily drive the mindset, and they don't necessarily create the system. They don't improve the system necessarily, right? So one of the failure modes that we see in people approaching Agile transformation is if I treat it like it was just another process, right, overlaid on top of the existing organization, that somehow the process or the exposing of impediments is going to magically resolve all this stuff. And what the net effect of that thinking is that you see a lot of folks that are really going through the motions of Scrum and trying to figure out why it's not working, okay? Because sure, Scrum is going to show us our impediments, but if we're not committed to fixing them, right? Because one of your impediments might be to refactor the 50-year-old COBOL platform, okay? That's like not something that the Scrum Master like runs off and gets taken care of by the next sprint planning meeting, right? So, I mean, there's like real legit things going on that we need to be very real about, okay? So what I'm going to try to make the case for here is that what we want to do is we want to look at the underlying systems of delivery. The business architecture of the organization, the technology architecture of the organization, how teams are formed and how teams are structured. What are the enabling entities within the enterprise? Okay? Because I believe that if we can get that kind of stuff worked out first, or at least have a plan to figure out how to work those kinds of things out, then we give a home base to great Scrum practices, great XP practices, great TDD, and all those kinds of things. We give a home base to DevOps and continuous integration and continuous deployment. And we create a context within the enterprise where Agile behaviors can begin to emerge. Okay? It's really difficult to ask people to think and behave differently when their environment is incongruent with those behaviors. Okay? So kind of the point of this little slide sequence is that executives care about real business value. If we're going to lead with culture or we're going to lead with practices, we really need to have a pretty clear hypothesis for how that cultural training and how those practices are actually going to create improvements in the system. Okay? How are those impediments actually going to get resolved? Okay? We need to have a plan for it. And my suggestion is that there's a lot of brokenness going on in most companies that we know before we start. I don't need Scrum to show me 2 weeks at a time. I know that we're not forming teams the right way. I know that we can't build backlogs. I know that our DevOps infrastructure sucks. I know that we can't do a build. I know that release management takes a long time. Right? So we need to be really real about those being the kinds of things that we're going to go fix. Okay? So what I want to pivot into now is I want to pivot into a discussion about what do I very specifically mean by this kind of systems first, environment first approach. Okay? So for the last couple years, I've been doing variants of this kind of a talk, and one of the early variants I talked about was this thing I call the three things. And I believe that these three things are the absolute most fundamental precondition for being able to do Agile well. Even to the point, I would say, if you're not doing these three things, there's no amount of Scrum that's going to fix it for you. Okay? I would suggest that there's nothing in Scrum that actually works, if you're not doing these three things. Okay? And these three things for me are backlogs, teams, and working tested software. So what does that mean? So I'm going to get really specific by what I mean by backlogs, teams, and working tested software. So a backlog in Agile, we all thematically know what that is. And you're like, okay, Mike, I came to your talk and you're telling me about a backlog. But when you really go back, right, you look at Alistair Coburn's work and use cases and his user story stuff, Mike Cohn's work, right, all the stuff Roman Pickler's done, right, all these guys, right, Bob Galen, right, he's here, right, he's written a lot of stuff on that. A backlog is a very specific thing. Right? It's user stories. They're written in a certain format. They're like a day or two or three big. We can do a handful of them in a sprint. They have this canonical form. They have this way that we collaborate around them. Most organizations that I walk into are not building backlog to that level of specificity. Okay? I like to go back to Bill Wake's thing, the INVEST model, right? Popularized by Mike Cohn. Independent, negotiable, valuable, estimatable, small, and testable. Right? That formula is there for a reason. Most backlogs that you see with teams trying to adopt Scrum are not like that. We can't estimate them, we can't interchange them, we can't pull one out, put another in, right? That kind of a thing. So one of the first preconditions that we need to look for when we're thinking about bringing a part of the organization into Agile is we want a hypothesis for how is that team, whatever team you're going to get pulled together, are they going to be able to get a backlog in the kind of the mechanism that we need to have that backlog? Okay? Absolute precondition. Sprint planning, sprint reviews, retrospectives, daily stand-ups, right? Every single thing breaks down if that team does not have clarity on the backlog, right? Every single thing breaks down. The next thing that I want to point out is the notion of teams. We use the word team very, very loosely, right? It's just a named group of people that are kind of assigned to something. But a team in Agile is different, right? A team in Agile is a group of 6 to 8 people that work together side by side. They swarm around it. They're T-shaped, right? They're specializing generalists, whatever metaphor you want to use, okay? But the idea is in Agile that a team has everything and everyone necessary to deliver the thing that is in the backlog, okay? Most organizations have at least one, if not 50, dependencies. They have part-time people. They have all kinds of different things. The problem with malformed teams is that when you have teams that don't stay together and can't get to a definition of done, they stop believing that they can, okay? They won't establish a stable velocity. Because really the magic formula of Agile, right, that kind of separates Agile from total chaos is if I know the size of my backlog and I know the velocity of the team, then I can start to determine, at least at a high level, how much scope I'm going to get through, how many sprints it's going to take me to get done. What is that?
How do you address an executive that thinks velocity should always increase?
That is off topic, but I'll be happy to. I will be happy to talk with you about that afterwards. Okay? Yeah, I mean, there's going to be all kinds of different management dysfunction we're going to go along the way, right? But what I'm suggesting is that we know how this is supposed to work, right? We know the size of the backlog, we know the velocity of the team, or at least we're supposed to, so we can start to derive scope, duration, cost, things like that. Okay? And so if I don't have a team that stays together, I will never stabilize velocity. And if I can't stabilize velocity, I'm never going to have any idea of when I'm going to be done. And you're absolutely fooling yourself if you think otherwise, right? And so it's just a problem, right? But these kinds of teams are really difficult to form in most large legacy organizations. Okay? The third piece, we have to be able to, again, I'm making sure I'm following my slides behind me. The third piece is we have to make sure that we can get to a reasonable definition of done at the end of the sprint. So we need to know what done looks like. We need to be able to test. We need to be able to validate. I'm not saying we have to go as far in every case to be able to deploy into production, but we have to be able to say, look, this is done and we don't have to go back and rework it anymore. Right? I came out of project management, and the joke was always, we're 90% done, we have 90% left to do, right? And the reason why is because writing the code is, no disrespect, it's the easy part, right? Making sure that it's right and that it's defect-free and that it didn't introduce a bunch of technical debt, right? That kind of stuff is hard, right? So sometimes we have to slow down the apparent throughput of lines of code and to get tested, working, done features. In most environments, that is non-trivial. Okay? So what I'm suggesting here is that these three things are difficult, but they are an absolute precondition to it. Okay, so let's see which slides I put in here next. Okay. So when we start to scale these ideas, we talk about the idea of governance, structure, and metrics. Okay? So governance is kind of a bad word in Agile sometimes, but it's basically just the way that we make economic trade-offs in the face of scarce resources. So the product owner in a pure play Scrum team is a governance mechanism to the team. They get to decide, they get to prioritize, they get to set business value, right? They get to do all those things. That's just governance. Okay? So there's a lot of different ways at scale to start thinking about lean, agile governance, right? SAFe introduces some lean, agile governance techniques. Large-scale Scrum introduces some governance techniques, right? Lots of different ways to do governance, not necessarily in the way we're doing it today, but there's healthy ways of doing lean, agile governance, okay? Structure. What does it look like to create cross-functional teams or networks of cross-functional teams that work together across the entire stack? Okay, what does done look like when it's a multi-team deployment and 8 or 9 or 10 or 100 teams have to come together? What are the metrics that we're going to use to control that? How are we going to throttle work across it, right? How are we going to make trade-off decisions and all those kinds of things, okay? So teams, backlogs, working, tested software at the lowest level become structure, governance, and metrics at the highest level. Okay? And understanding that if we can't get these kinds of things installed at some point, then there's not a whole lot that's going on in our transformation that is of much other value. Okay? Now, if you're... Yeah, there we go. Okay. So what gets in the way? One of my favorite meetings I did was in Atlanta, and there was a group of CIOs that I was doing a lunch and learn kind of with. And one of the CIOs raises his hand and goes, but yeah, Mike, that stuff's really hard. How do I go about doing it? And I put this next slide up, and I was talking about all the different things that get in the way. And he said, but that's what my environment is. I've got technical debt. I've got defects. I've got a matrixed organization. I've got this and that and the other. I got dependencies all over the place. Okay? And I said, yep, it's your job to fix them. Okay? And part of the challenge that I think that we're not being incredibly transparent about as an Agile community is the fact that we know the brokenness, right? We know the failure modes in the organization, okay? And what we're doing often is we're saying, let's train people on Agile and get them doing Scrum, and then all of the impediments will show themselves, and it'll be up to us to fix them. But it's kind of like what I said earlier, when your impediment is a 50-year-old mainframe platform that's actually running several many billions of revenue, it's really tough, right? It's really tough. But to get to the point where we're really doing Agile, where we're really doing an Agile transformation, where we can get the culture change and we can get the behavior change and we can get all the different kinds of changes, this is the kind of stuff that has to be fixed. Okay? So here's kind of like my theory of transformation. Adopting Agile is about forming teams, building backlogs, and regularly producing increments of working tested software. Adopting Agile at scale is about defining structure, establishing governance, and creating metrics and tooling strategy that supports agility. Anything that gets in the way is an impediment to transformation. The stuff that gets in the way of doing that is actually the work of the transformation. Okay? Training people is like it's a necessary activity, but it's an activity. The outcome is a better performing organization. In order to get a better performing organization, you actually have to improve in the organization what's broken. That work is the work of a transformation. Does that make sense? I'm going to pause for a second and rest my vocal cords. Any questions? I could probably take a question. No? You guys drinking from the fire hose? It's just crazy talk. I thought I could just go to Scrum School and everything would be great. Yes?
Thinking back years ago, the group I was in, we actually did a large-scale Agile transformation without really knowing anything about Agile or Agile was training. It appears that what we actually did was we sort of recursively did the Agile transformation as an Agile project by figuring out the pieces we needed to do to introduce successive increments of functionality to the organization, and then allowing those successes to sort of snowball on themselves, and other people say, yeah, that works. Now I'll get more engaged with you and tell you I need this and this, which effectively builds a backlog. So you can kind of use the same methods to do the transformation as is the transformation.
Yeah, so what I suspect is that when people come to me and they go, well, hey, I did a transformation this way or I did a transformation that way, I think most successful transformations were predicated on this kind of a pattern. Whether that was explicit or not, maybe they didn't really realize what was going on, but if you successfully transformed something, then you probably implemented these patterns. One of the patterns we see that's really interesting quite a bit is an executive that goes from one organization to the other. And in the previous organization, they were really successful just introducing Agile practices and cultural stuff and everything. Chances are if that worked, it was because they had a really natural team-based organization and there was a lot of decoupling between them and there weren't a ton of dependencies and everything. And the practices and the culture and the mindset, it became an enabler or a force multiplier on top of whatever they had, which I would totally agree with, right? But then they do the same thing in the next organization and they've got that 50-year legacy platform, they got all this technical debt, defects, dependencies, misalignment, all that kind of stuff. And the same technique doesn't work because the underlying patterns that enabled it over here weren't available and they didn't have to fix it over here. Now they've got to fix it in their new organization. Does that make sense?
Part of it, I think, is identifying some of those anti-habits or the impediments.
Yeah.
And finding a way to tackle them and show how you did that in an Agile form.
Yeah.
And letting it snowball, so success breeds success.
Yeah, so I'm going to talk a little bit about how we recommend to structure and plan these things. So good timing. So this kind of notion of structure first or systems first is predicated on the idea that we're going to look for patterns organizationally for how we want to form and ultimately encapsulate teams. Okay? And by encapsulate, I mean allow them to operate with autonomy with minimal dependencies between them. Okay? So most organizations, there's a kind of a hidden underlying pattern that you can discover. And it generally means that we've got some sort of services teams, think microservices, right, that are providing core capabilities across the platform. You've got feature teams that are consuming those services. You might do some kind of program coordination team. You might do some sort of systems team if you're doing SAFe. You might end up doing some sort of portfolio teaming. But one of the things that we really believe in is this idea that you can begin to think about how to form teams at scale. We know that we want encapsulation. We know that we want to create dedicated cross-functional teams. We might not get it right out of the gate, but we want to have a pretty good idea of what we're going for right out of the gate. So most organizations in some form or fashion tend to look something like this. There's a set of shared services, there's a set of services that get coordinated by a program team, that get coordinated by some sort of subordinate to some sort of portfolio team, okay? Almost always when we're in the presence of dependencies do we need coordinating entities. So here's kind of the rule of thumb, right? We want things to be very loosely coupled, right? We want encapsulation. We want no dependencies. But here's the thing where sometimes we go wrong in the Agile community. We want to pretend dependencies don't exist because they shouldn't exist when they actually do exist. Okay? And the challenge is that most large, complicated organizations are not going to self-organize dependencies. Okay? And so when you have dependencies, when you don't have the right level of encapsulation, you have to have more orchestration. As you begin to encapsulate, break dependencies, you can deprecate some of the orchestration. So the challenge is that in the presence of dependencies have to be managed somehow. Okay? We can assume that they'll be self-managed. I don't see that that generally works in most cases. And then we have to figure out how much coordination then we're going to need. Okay? But most organizations at some form of scale start to look like a pyramid of teams. Okay? You guys will recognize this. This is, very much the kind of pattern that SAFe has deployed. Typically, Scrum is a great enabling set of processes to govern the performance of execution-oriented teams, right? When you start putting in orchestration layers and you start putting in coordination, we typically will tend to run those in more of a Kanban-based system, okay? When we're talking about a governance and portfolio is basically just a Kanban system of projects. Hopefully small projects, small batch size, right? But it's basically a Kanban system of projects, okay? So you start to think about what does the end state vision of an organization that's going to Agile look like when they've got dependencies, right? When there's stuff to manage. And it looks something like this. Then we start thinking about what metrics that we want to use, right? So this is a handful of like starter metrics that you can use at different levels, right? So a big part of what we're trying to do is we're trying to think about what is the work of the transformation. The work of the transformation is forming teams, getting teams backlogs, getting teams the ability to produce working tested software, and then ultimately starting to systematically break the dependencies in the system so that we can improve the local autonomy and start to deprecate some of the control and actually let these teams begin to operate in a more emergent way. So now we're going to start tying some concepts together. The work of an Agile transformation, right, the unit of value is a transformed organization, okay? Now, what we have to figure out how to do is how to take that transformed organization and break it into smaller pieces, okay? So we use some words in our practice. We talk about expeditions and base camps. But basically what we're really saying is that the process of going through a transformation is incremental and iterative, okay? Do you guys remember Jeff Patton's Mona Lisa picture? I should probably insert it in here because I keep talking about it at this stage of this talk. But Jeff Patton's Mona Lisa picture describes, it's really kind of cool, right? It talks about incremental as like doing the quadrants, right? Imagine the Mona Lisa in 4, right? So an incremental painting would be do the upper left, upper right, lower left, lower right, right? That's painting it in increments. Painting it in iterations is like doing a sketch and then doing a watercolor and then putting oil on it, and then fine-tuning the oil, okay? So you can think about transforming an organization in the same fundamental way. You can think about breaking it into chunks, increments, and you can think about iterating it and helping it get better over time. Okay? Sometimes we tend to think about, well, I just need to go straight to where I want to be, realizing that there's all these barriers, right, that are going to get in the way. Okay? So if you think about the backlog of a transformation, the epic feature and user story decomposition is a subset of the organization basically moving through progressive levels of maturity, right? Forming teams, building backlogs, producing working tested software, right? Breaking impediments over time, okay? I need to get somebody trained. I need to get a scrum master hired. I need to run a workshop. Those are activities. Those are not the value that you provide, okay? So when we're going back to our executives, what we want to be able to say is, I took slice of organization 1 and I got it to this level of performance. And then I made some improvements and I got it to this level of performance. Then I made some improvements and I got it to this level of performance. You guys with me on that? Okay? It's not I got them trained. It's that they are performing better. Okay? And the hard part, right, what makes this difficult is that the impediments in the organization initially prevent it from getting better. It makes it difficult for it to get better. Okay? So what you've got to do is you've got to build the case. You're like, this is how good I can get it while it's got impediments. Then I get the impediments broken and I can say, this is how much better it can be. This is how much better it can be after that. Okay? So incremental transformation is basically taking like an entire slice of the organization and implementing it in Agile, which would mean forming the teams, putting together the orchestration layers, the program and the portfolio layer, getting whatever tooling you're using, if whether it be Jira or whiteboards or sticky notes or version 1 or Rally or whatever, right? Getting your tooling installed, getting metrics baselines going, getting the system delivering and performing. Okay? Figuring out what slice you want to start with and implementing the entire stack of delivery. Because what the executive is going to care about is how is this part of the organization performing better as a result of you having been here to do it, right? So that's what I mean by incremental. It's about figuring out which slice of the organization and getting the whole value stream, if you want to call it that, delivering. Okay? But we recognize again, right? So then you pick up the next ones, right? So what we would recognize then is that the transformation process, because we have impediments, because we don't have perfectly formed teams, because we have all these things in the way, also has to be incremental. Okay? We can't just go train everybody in Scrum, everybody's doing daily stand-up meetings, we're done, right? We have to have the systematic removing of the dependencies. And so we call these things base camps. Oop. I'm lost, Devin. What happened, man? Hold on, maybe I lost focus. Hold on a second. Oh, yeah, it looks like. Okay, cool. So what the iterative side of transformation is how are we going to communicate progressive maturity and performance of the slices that we're interacting with. And so what we roughly outline is kind of like a potentially a five-step kind of transformation sequence. The first thing that you can do generally is help the organization get stable and predictable. Okay, help it get to the point where it's able to make and meet commitments. It's not really, are we building the right thing? Are we operating with agility? Are we it's like, got dependencies, I've got all this legacy stuff, I've got all this stuff. So what we're going to do is we're going to form teams, we're going to get them really clear backlogs, we're going to get them stabilizing velocity, we're going to get them to where they can do like a rolling 3-month plan, they should be able to operate against some sort of roadmap. Probably not super agile at this point, but dependencies make agile hard, right? But what we want to do is we want to stabilize the system in place. Then we want to start to think about how do we get things into market faster. Sometimes that next phase is about reducing the size of the projects in the portfolio, getting smaller things. It could be about taking the waste out of the release management process. It could be about introducing some better testing practices, breaking testing and integrating it in with the delivery stream a little bit more effectively, right? But the idea is stabilize and then start to improve, right? So then we start to reduce batch size. Then at that stage, you're going to hit a wall because more than likely you can't go any further without some technology refactoring. Right? You've got to ultimately really start to encapsulate the technology components, move from to a microservices architecture or something like that, start to go to the cloud, start to put DevOps, continuous integration and deployment kinds of things in. Okay? But that's not usually step one, because in step one, you don't really know what your architecture looks like. You don't know what you want it to be. You don't know how you're going to organize and plan around it. So stabilize the system in place, then reduce your batch size, then start to really refactor. And what's cool is that once you get some of these component things refactored and you've got actually dedicated teams around encapsulated technology, then you can start to say, okay, I'm going to give you a bucket of money. Go solve this really cool problem, because now you're not necessarily dependent upon anything else in the organization. You've actually legitimately broken the dependencies. And what that starts to look like at scale is, let's say, for example, you have a platform strategy and a go-to-market customer-facing strategy. One of the things that we do is oftentimes we let the front end drive requirements into the back end services. Not every company operates that way. Some say, this is how we're going to evolve our platform. The sales guys can only go out and sell the stuff that's actually going to be in the platform or in the platform's roadmap. Right? They can't inject dependencies down into the back end. That's kind of like a step 4 level of maturity. But you have to have decoupled teams in order before you can really start to think about doing that. Right? And then step 5 is more like a radical like innovation kind of thing. Like, okay, here's a bucket of money, go solve this problem. Kind of a deal. Okay? So when we think about incremental transformation, right, we're talking about taking the organization and breaking it into slices. When we think about iterative transformation, we're thinking about what does the continuous improvement plan look like to get the organization from where it is today to where we need it to be in the future. Okay? How am I doing on time? I think I'm almost, where am I supposed to wrap up? About 1:40, 1:30? 1:30? Okay, cool. So let me scooch over here, right? So then these things work together, right? So now what you can start to think about is you're moving your transformation by taking slices and moving them through this progression. So what you'll end up with is you'll end up with slices that are further ahead than other slices in the organization, right? And it becomes a really cool way of being able to communicate progress. So when I put this talk together, it was for Agile 2016 last year. And I was trying to think like what would it be like if I were going to try to articulate steps to doing a transformation, right? What would it actually look like? And this is a lot of what we're doing kind of in our internal practice to communicate with our clients about how we're making progress. One of my big impetuses, just to total candor, is that as an external consulting agency, when we go in and we sell a transformation, we are accountable to our executives in this way, right? We have to be able to communicate progress or we don't get hired, right, is what it boils down to. And so you guys as internal coaches and consultants, I think, can take the same kind of ideas, recognize that to get the funding that you need to even sustain your internal practices, that you guys have to be fiduciarily responsible to your executives as well. Okay? So kind of what the high-level process that we've put together is, first of all, build a leadership coalition, right? Engage the executives. Make sure that they're on board and that they understand what it is that you're getting ready to do. A big part of that is set their expectations. Let them know how you're going to advocate for the architecture, how you're going to break things up into slices, the kinds of impediments that they're going to see, the kinds of investments that they're going to make, get their buy-in, get a forum together for you guys to be able to hold yourselves accountable. Next step, define an end-state vision. I don't think, and this is kind of the first point that I made, is that it's responsible to say that we're just going to train people and hope for the best, right? That kind of train and pray strategy, right? It's not really effective. I think it's reasonable. I think we know the patterns of how to form teams at scale, okay? So when we talk about an end state vision, with relatively little effort, right, we understand the patterns. We understand where we need to form teams, where we need to create orchestration layers, what we're going to do in SAFe or versus what we're going to do in something else. Where are the dependencies that we have to break, right? So an end state vision basically paints a picture of where it is that we're going. And then once you have the picture, right, then we can lay out a roadmap. What are the different chunks? What are the different expeditions, we call them, right? The increments. And then how do we intend to progress them through different levels of maturity? Okay? And you can take an entire organization, 700, 800 people, break it into 150 person slices, understand what teams are going to be formed, how they're going to form, what we're going to do to them, and then lay that out kind of over time. Okay? Call that building a roadmap. Next step. This is where it starts to get really like Agile if we really understand the nature of the backlog, right? So you think about a release plan, usually about 90 days, right? Program increment if you want to use SAFe, okay? You can create a rolling 90-day plan of all of the different elements in the organization that you're going to impact. You know, over the next 90 days, we're going to work with these 8 teams, and we're going to create these 2 program teams, and we're going to operate within this portfolio. We're going to install this set of tools and get these metrics baselined, right? And at some point, we have to show up and we have to do the work, right? But we know that that's going to be very dynamic, right? The work, the 90-day plan, the release plan is like when we know the most about what it is we're going to do, right? So think of it as like a release backlog, okay? What are the teams we're going to form? What are the entities we're going to interact with? What's the level of performance we're going to get to, right? That kind of a thing. So you've got the end state vision, you've got the transformation roadmap. Now we put together a detailed 90-day plan that's kind of like our release plan for building a product. Okay? But it's subordinate up to that roadmap. Then we start to get into the habit of doing like a 30-day sprint kind of a thing, or you could do this as could be a 2-week checkpoint or a 30-day checkpoint, where now we're engaging our team members. We're doing the work of the transformation. We're running the workshops. We're doing the training. We're forming the teams, right? We're getting them performant. We're coaching with them. We're working with them in the team room, right? All that kind of stuff. Okay? But here's the interesting thing, right? When we're doing this now, we're doing the work, right? We're doing the same work that we were doing before, but now we're doing it in the context of a 90-day plan. We're doing it in the context of a roadmap. We're doing it in the context of an end-state vision. Now we can go to our executives and we can say, okay, we spent this much of the funding over the last quarter. This was the organization we impacted. This organization went from having no predictability to this great measurable predictability, and we can pull this all out of the tools. We can show like what the next step's going to be, what the next step after that's going to be. Okay? We don't know all of the activities we're going to do, but we can start to get good at sequencing the outcomes that we're trying to achieve, right? And getting really real about the nature of the work that's necessary to go into that. Connect activity and outcomes. I just kind of talked about that. Connect outcomes to business objectives. One of the conversations we have internally quite a bit is that goals and objectives and outcomes are kind of recursive. You know, we know that we want to make more money as a company, right? But to do that, we have to break down some of these barriers. In order to break down some of these barriers, we need to break the organization into small chunks. Once we break the organization into small chunks, then we have to get it to certain levels of performance. To get it to certain levels of performance, we have to achieve these intermediate outcomes. Achieve these intermediate outcomes, we have to basically do this work, right? But what we want to do is we want to roll all that up, right, and connect the dots for the executives. Because the Holy Grail, right, of internal consultancies and external consultancies is to be able to say, these were the dollars that I spent, and here's the measurable outcomes that we achieved, and to be able to link those two together, right? That's how you self-fund an Agile transformation, okay? So incorporate feedback, manage communication, create safety for everyone involved. That's why we doing these names and boxes and getting some of this plan. It's like, it doesn't have to be a figure it out as we go. And when people understand where they fit in the overall process, that creates a lot of safety for people. They understand where they're at in the sequence. They understand what their job's going to look like in the front. They can mentally prepare, right? They can lay it out. So I guess really what this talk is about, right? It's probably a couple things. It's like understand the nature of transformation work. The unit of transformation is an organization that is getting better, right? Then we can start to talk about what does it look like to do iterative and incremental transformation at scale. Then once we've got that, right, and we understand that that is our fundamental framework, teams, backlogs, working tests of software, break dependencies, do this in this iterative and incremental way, then we can start kind of laying out a roadmap and these release plans and these 90-day plans to where we can be held accountable to make sure that the executives understand the dollars that are being spent to the actual outcomes achieved. Okay? But you gotta think about the work fundamentally different. That's why that first part of the talk was so important. Once you anchor on that and you understand how it's supposed to function and what the work of a transformation is, then it becomes really fun, right? It becomes like an Agile project to actually do it. You know? And a long time I always heard people say, use Agile to implement Agile, but what they really meant was get together every 2 weeks and plan and do a daily stand-up meeting, right? But the art is in what's in the backlog, right? And if we get the right stuff in the backlog and then we enable it with Agile practices, right? Then we've got a shot at actually being, I think, effective with our executive teams. I think we got a couple minutes. Anybody want to ask a question? Yes, sir. Yeah. Yeah, so anytime you make something come across as sequential, right? I mean, it's all of this stuff is you've got to get to an end state as fast as you can. You've got to get to this, right? You've got to get names in boxes. Inevitably, people start to talk whenever consultants show up, right? It's all red staplers and stuff like that, right? People are concerned, right? So yeah, right? So you want to get to that, right? So you try to do lunch and learns and you try to educate. And there's a lot of things that you can do on the side while you're building out this kind of plan. Do you have a question? Oh, you look like you're raising your hand. Anybody else? We good? Okay, guys, thanks for coming. I appreciate it.